address can be outlined by three basic questions. What is your problem? That's what we're talking about, investigation. What does God say about your problem? Call that interpretation. And then what does God say to do about your problem? We might call that implementation, right? So those three are just bread and butter. That's what we're after here. And so we want to look at primarily investigation. We might get a little bit into interpretation as well, but we really want to hone in on investigation, data gathering. We said in those early meetings, or especially in a first meeting with someone that you're not exactly sure what's going on, the two main things you want to do is just gather lots of information. You're going to be doing a lot of listening rather than a lot of talking, and then giving lots of hope. So that's very important. So for this material, like even these others, especially in these eyes, I'm drawing on a lot of prior material that's been really well thought out on this, and I'm just kind of compiling it into my own little way of presenting it. But much of this is borrowed material, just to put that out there, from either syllabuses of mine or others' books that I've gleaned from, and just kind of pulling these together for us. So much of this material is not original to me. But it's helpful. So investigation, gathering information about the person, their situation. Really, if I'm going to meet with someone in a more formal way, that first meeting, I'm just going to tell them up front, hey, I'm just going to be asking lots of questions and listening a lot and trying to take notes and understand the situation well. And so just to give them an expectation of that. Of course, there is a give and take. It's in interacting and counseling, but especially at first, we don't want to speak too quickly to give answers before we understand the situation. So I think that just puts people at ease, lets them kind of share what the problems are. So let's ask the first question: why gather data? Why gather data? And for this, I want us to turn to Proverbs 18. We get a lot of mileage out of this chapter when it comes to this step here. In Proverbs 18. There's really three key verses that we want to focus upon for gathering data. And the first is in verse 13, Proverbs 18:13. It says this: if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. So before you hear, if you just start spouting off things, I know what your situation, then you're very liable to misunderstand the situation or at least all the details, and it will be foolish to do so. Another verse is verse 15. An intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. So if you're wise, you want knowledge. You want to acquire what's going on. What is the situation? Let me get all sides of the situation. And that's what's relevant in verse 17. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. Example after example could be multiplied here. Think of like with kids, right? Something happens and one kid says like, oh yeah, they did this. And you're like, oh wow, that sounds really bad. And then you talk to the other one and they're like, well yeah, because they did this to me. And you're like, oh, that's some interesting, relevant information. That's kind of changes the dynamic. Or in a marriage, if you just met with one and you don't have the side of the other, then you may get skewed because we're by nature, this is back to the heart, we're self-favoring, right? We're self-favoring. We're gonna put ourselves in the best light possible. So this is another reason to consider both sides as well. One person kind of summarized these three verses, 13, 15, and 17, by saying, listen for the facts, verse 13, listen actively for facts, verse 15, listen actively for all the facts, verse 17. Okay, so listen for the facts, listen actively for facts, and listen actively for all the facts. Listen to, some of this is just common sense, but listen to John 7, starting in verse 50. This is the context of the people's opposition to Jesus, and here Nicodemus in verse 50, who had gone to him before, and who was one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? What Nicodemus is trying to say is, hey, don't we have to gather some more information here? Don't we need to give this guy a hearing, figure out what the details are before we make a decision? And that's just the principle that's just understood. Why else do we need to gather data? Why else do we need to gather data? Well, 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 14 would tell us that there are different categories of people we might encounter. 1 Thessalonians 5:14 says, "And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." So, yeah, who are you dealing with here? And notice how you're to be patient with all of them, but there's somewhat of a slight different approach to each of these categories of people. How do you know what situation they're in unless you've gathered relevant data? And to know what's going on there. We said, like, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, It's like our thing here, but different. And so we want to make sure we gather the right relevant information. Another example, that we've kind of talked about this, but what's another biblical example of not gathering enough data and misinterpreting the situation and thus giving poor counsel? Like really big, whole book of the Bible, mostly devoted to this. Early book of the Bible. Job, yeah, right? So you've got his friends who come to him and they sit with him for 7 days, but they're not asking any questions, they're silent. And some kind of say like that was their best move when they said nothing to Job. And then they start opening their mouths. And we've already talked about how Job is such a profound book as far as the wisdom of God, the fear of God, and really how you have the best of the best in these three categories, these three fields of really a historian in Eliphaz, a scientist in Bildad, and a philosopher theologian in Zophar. And they're basically the best of the best in their fields, offering human wisdom, and they're saying, Job, we know your situation, we get it, and this is the situation, this is what's going on in your life. And yet none of them gets it right. Now they say some true things, but they apply it wrongly, so it's wrong. And so they haven't gathered relevant data, and they do great harm to Job in the process. And at the end, or at the middle, like chapter 28, Job says, where can wisdom be found? Well, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. And so unless you start with God, unless you start with his revelation, you cannot know for certain what's really going on in a person's situation. So Job is about the ultimate argument for epistemology, how we know what we know. We know what we know for certain because God reveals it to us. And so also another reason why we have to counsel from God's word and not just from secular theories. So they rely on human wisdom, not divine wisdom, and they don't listen, and so they become terrible counselors. So much so that, listen to what Job 19 says. Job 19, verse 1 to 3. Then Job answered and said, "How long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? These 10 times you have cast reproach upon me, and you are not ashamed to wrong me. And even if it be true that I have erred, my error remains with myself." And so he's like, you guys are just assaulting me here. And so does great damage. Here's another passage, Jeremiah 6, verse 14. It says, "They have healed the wound of my people lightly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." So they're contradicting Jeremiah's message. And so here's another danger of in this case, they did have the knowledge because Jeremiah told them, but they were rejecting it. But nevertheless, they were misdiagnosing the issues and therefore giving bad counsel. So it won't only help the one you're counseling know more, but it will often, gathering relevant data will, of course, help you if you're trying to help someone else to know the situation rightly, but it's also going to help the person who you're trying to help because maybe they're confused about what the issue is, like our silly video. And as you ask more questions and they just start revealing more of what's going on, they come to a realization of, wait a minute, yeah, they're learning about themselves as you're drawing them out and asking questions about the situation, helping frame it even in how you're seeking to understand the situation. Really, many people don't think that deeply about their problems. They think on a kind of a surface level plane. And so asking more questions and drawing out the heart helps them to realize, oh, wow, this goes deeper than I realized, or this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I think a lot of us initially, we don't realize how things are connected to one another. And so someone who can kind of draw us out, objectively kind of gather some data, and then lay it out in an understandable way can be very helpful for us to understand our situation better. It also helps us to know what approach we should take with a person. We said this already in 1 Thessalonians 5, but also think about Jesus' interaction with Nicodemus in John 3 compared to his interaction with the woman at the well of Samaria in chapter 4. There's like a different tact that he has, and he's just kind of hearing them, asking them questions, and then he approaches them in slightly different ways, ultimately with the purpose of helping. So, why gather data? Why gather data? Well, we want to follow the principles of Proverbs. We want to know who we're dealing with. We want to not offer hurtful counsel, but helpful counsel, and know who we're dealing with. Any other things that you might throw in there, maybe we didn't cover, that would say, why gather data? Why is this significant? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So, yeah, having to put it into words for the person who's struggling is very helpful. And they maybe realize that they can't. And so that's going to be helpful as well in trying to help them and draw them out. So, absolutely. Things seem, I know this as a public speaker, it's like things I'm like, oh yeah, this is really clear in my head. And then you start to talk and you're like, this is not clear. What? The problem is not with them though, it's with me, There's like a saying that says, what is it? Fog in the pulpit, mist in the pew, or something like that, So, yeah, lots of benefit in gathering good data. Let's move on as well to what data should be gathered. Okay, let's say you're convinced. Okay, we got to gather good data. What do we gather? What are we asking for here? And I'm going to use an acronym that many have used that just kind of summarizes big categories of things you want to learn about in a situation that would be relevant, and it's the acronym PREACH. PREACH, P-R-E-A-C-H. Also, let me just say, there's a lot of information I'm going to give you in this, so if you'd rather not take notes and try and grab all this, I will happily send you notes on this, so if that puts you at ease to just take it in. So, preach. So, P stands for physical questions. So, you want to know, tell me about your sleep. Are you sleeping? And because there are significant issues that come if you're not sleeping. I think certain things of psychosis are because of hallucinations because you're not sleeping. You're not sleeping. So sleep patterns, medications that someone might be on that might be affecting them and having an impact. Diet, what kind of diet? Exercise or activity level. That's going to have an impact. I think we all know this, that if you're just sedentary, it just has an impact on you versus if you're having some level of exercise, it just has a good impact upon you in dealing with just those low-level kind of stress. Illnesses, health problems, even how much coffee a person drinks, right? There might be issues coming with that, stimulants in that way, or how much screen time do you have, right? There's a lot of research coming out now that is showing there's a book that just came out called The Anxious Generation, and it's talking about the effect that this is having upon people. We are guinea pigs, right? Tony Reinke has done a lot of good writing on this technology and 12 ways your phone is changing you and all these things. And by and large, our generation just has not thought about this. We've just we're the guinea pigs just taking it in. And there's been more and more people over the last 10 years who have been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of Christians as well, and saying okay, we need to give more thought to this. I just saw, I'm getting off task here, but I just saw some state that was trying to legislate that you could not have a phone, a smartphone in school. It's that would be great, that would be phenomenal, but who knows if it'll pass. So I didn't have a smartphone in school, but then again, I'm the birth of the iPhone generation. So fee. That would be like a Greek letter that sounds with peace. I'm crossing languages. P, physical. R, resources and relationships. Wayne Mack says the resources that the counselee has at his or her disposal. That's what we mean here. And so the obvious one, the first and most obvious one would be spiritual resources. So here's where you want to figure out the question, is this person a genuine Christian? Have they been regenerated? Because if they're not, then they don't have the resources that Christians would have to grow and change in a lasting way. Yes, we've already said this, people can change, but not all change is sanctification. Not all change is God glorifying, right? People get skinnier, people go on diets, people get stronger, people stop smoking or doing whatever. But that's not God glorifying change. And so do they have spiritual resources? Are they saved? You want to ask these questions. And also, maybe they say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, but you want to ask more than just, are you a Christian? You say, well, tell me about your testimony. Tell me about your understanding of the gospel and understand those things, because maybe they think they're a Christian, but they're not, right? They've just never been genuinely converted. And that's going to be significant of who we're dealing with. Of course, we'll meet with someone who's not a Christian, and just say, hey, this is really your biggest need, but let's keep talking about these other things and just keep bringing it back to that. So are they a believer? Then let's just say they are a believer. What kind of believer are they? Are they mature? Are they immature? Are they a new believer? Are they a seasoned believer? That's going to kind of change somewhat. If they're a very mature believer, they have a lot of knowledge, but they're not putting it into practice, then maybe your instruction is going to be less on instruction as to informing them of what they should know, but rather exhorting them and practically helping them to put into practice what they have not been doing, right? So just because you have a lot of head knowledge doesn't mean you're mature spiritually. Putting your knowledge into practice means you're mature. And so that's helpful to know as well. What kind of resources? I think other resources to consider as well beyond their spiritual condition and spiritual maturity is things like resources like their job situation, their church situation, what kind of resources they have there, their relationships, just what kind of help do they have for this problem, or hindrances to change in their lives related to relationships. People are making it difficult for them to grow and change. Their job situation, the intellectual resources. Where are they at? Don't overwhelm someone. We're going to get to the homework stage later, but don't overwhelm someone who may not be able to handle the kind of stuff you're giving them. Just meet them where they're at. So assess that as you're talking to them. Social resources. So resources and relationships. E is emotions or feelings. Emotions are like a smoke detector. They kind of reveal what's going on. It's almost like the overflow of the heart. You see how people are responding. Are they feelings oriented in their decisions, or how are they processing things? And those are going to be not definitive, but they're going to certainly inform you. You would be remiss to disregard their emotions. And so we want to discern kind of how are they responding to this in that way. And then A is actions, their behavior. You want to consider sins of commission, sins of omission. What are they doing that they ought not to be doing, or what are they failing to do that God has responsibilities for them? So that's something you want to consider, where they're not fulfilling biblical responsibilities as well. So those are their actions. C refers to conceptual, or in other words, their thinking, how they're conceiving things. What are their goals? What are their values, their desires, their motives, their beliefs? That's going to play massively into their feelings as well as their actions. And then H stands for historical, which means just their past, their present, good and bad things in their past context, things in their present context that are influencing, maybe failures, school or job problems, relationships, patterns in their life. We don't want to fall off on either end of the spectrum. Of course, you think about caricatures of secular models of psychology, which are all about the past, and even so much so that they can at times almost make people have memories that they've never had before, that never actually happened, because the way they go about questioning, they're trying to make it seem like something happened to them in their past, because that's the presupposition they have. And so they're a little too focused on how determinative the past is. But we ought to realize that people are shaped by their past, and we're not there's a helpful principle, the sins of the fathers, right? So sometimes people think genetically that I'm an alcoholic because my family was alcoholics, and they think it's genetic, but it's probably more so that it's related to patterns of behavior that they've witnessed over time, and they've seen that, and so they've practiced that as well. And so that's helpful to know certain things about people's past and how that's influenced, how it's shaped their beliefs and their responses. You want to see habitual patterns of like, how do they respond to a stressful circumstance? What are their habitual responses? And that's going to help you learn how do they need to be rehabituated to respond differently when those things happen. Habits are great because they help us function. You probably didn't think about how you're going to brush your teeth, the mechanics of it, because you've just done it. But this happens in other areas as well. You can have bad habits where you come to a situation, you respond to it, and you just have this habitual response because it's a learned pattern of behavior. And we want our godliness to be as easy as possible. We want as many good, biblical, godly habits so that godliness is easier, so to speak, because we just have practiced over time. These are the preach: physical, resources, relationships, emotions, actions, conceptual, thinking, and historical. I also like to ask, just a little extra, a person what they've already done about their problem. What is your problem, of course, but what have you done already? Or I like to ask it even more specific and say, where in the Bible have you found the most help for this situation? Where in God's Word have you drawn the most comfort or encouragement or help or direction? And sometimes you'll find that say, well, I really haven't thought about that. Okay, that's information. You're just, great, okay, we'll keep talking about that. Maybe God will use more in His Word to show you how relevant it is. I also like to ask them, how do you think I can help you with this problem? That's going to reveal a lot about what their expectations are. And I like to remind people, maybe not on the first time, but that meeting with someone is not magic hour. It's not magic hour. It's not like, come talk to me and I'll fix your problems. It's actually, we're trying to help them interpret their problems biblically and know what God would have them to do. What really produces change is as they depend on the Spirit and put into practice what they're learning. So if they do nothing through the week, really there's no expectation that they would change or do anything different. If they just meet with someone for an hour once a week or whatever, however often, that's not what's going to change them. It is them putting into practice, and that's what maturity is. It's not just, let me fill your head with more knowledge. That's not maturity. It's let me help you implement what you have learned, or maybe you need to learn it, and then see that worked out in your life. So that's part of what data should be gathered in a big picture. Any questions about that? I have more on what kind of data should be gathered. Just a few other things, but come up for air for a second. Maggie, do you have any more water in that cup next to you? Okay, let me have some of that while people think. Thank you. Relevant data to our situation here. Yeah, physical. We're like, yeah, you're doing great. A couple other things, verbal data and visual data. So verbal data, obviously, not only you're looking for what is said, you're trying to hear what they're saying, but also how they're saying it, right? Because that's significant. Say you have a married couple in here, and they're telling you about their situation, and he says something that's accurate and true, but he's big eye roll. You're like, well, okay, that's interesting. How did he say that? So that's going to help you understand the situation. But visual data, and sometimes counselors call this halo data. You think, why halo data? Probably because halo is like over your head, and it's just like visual aids. And so you're saying, well, like you want to take in. Now, this can easily be misinterpreted, but it's also relevant because you're just trying to see what's their demeanor, how they carry themselves. And it comes in two ways: nonverbal communication, it's like, or the manner that they speak, the tone that they have, and also what they won't talk about. Those things are visual in a way. Here's a list someone else gave. Just think about nonverbal but visual data that you could gather, right? A clammy handshake, alcohol in the breath, little or no eye contact, teary-eyed, facial expressions and body language that show anger, indifference, sadness, sleepy, embarrassment, tension, nervousness, evasive, frequent nervous laughter, fidgeting and shifting, finger tapping. I do that a lot, but trust me, I'm not, no. Oh, Feedback, all right. Nail biting, hand wringing. I was like, who's talking to me? That sounds like me. Quivering, shaky voice, speaking in loud or low tones, or being talkative, reticent or reluctant to talk, sarcasm, clothing or general appearance, posture. I mean, now, these are relevant, but just be careful. You can misinterpret these. And here's a good example, or can you think of a good example in the Old Testament, book of Samuel, I'm really helping you out here, where someone's nonverbals were misinterpreted by someone? Oh, yeah, that's another good one. Yeah, right? So, he's acting. I was thinking of Hannah, right? Hannah's praying, and Eli's like, oh, she must be drunk, right? Well, that was a wrong interpretation. So, within reason, keep that in mind. But at the same time, you might be learning things about them that you just want to take note of and say, that's interesting. That's noteworthy, but maybe I don't have enough to understand it yet. So just, take it all in. So that's visual and verbal. That's what should be gathered. You could say more about that, but we've looked at why gather data, what should be gathered, and then how should you gather data? How should you gather data? And obviously there's a number of ways to do this, and it should be ongoing. I'll often use, if I'm in a meeting with someone that I don't really know them well and what their situation really is, then I will give them, counselors often call this a PDI, a personal data inventory. And so to say asking a barrage of questions that just kind of help speed the process up. So the whole first time meeting with them is not spent like asking those questions. They can easily just fill it out, almost like at a doctor's office where you would, fill out things and the doctor can look at it real quick and go, okay, and they're going to follow up on certain things. Go, oh, you said this, tell me more about that. And that's just helpful to speed up the process. So I've often used that, and it's helpful at kind of speeding up the process. But within that, here's just some big categories. One is extensive questioning, and one is intensive questioning. So I'm going to give you a gun illustration so you can helpfully remember this. So extensive questioning is like a shotgun approach. It's a scatter approach. That's what you're doing. You're kind of moving across the surface, asking a little about a lot. So you're just kind of general categories. So you're just kind of asking a little about a lot over questions about faith. Tell me about, are you a Christian? Tell me about your walk with the Lord, your marriage, family, job, health, history, problems, finances. These are just kind of, just surface level, kind of extensive, but overall a broad category of areas. That's extensive questioning, like a shotgun. And then there's intensive questioning, which is more like a rifle. It's a single focus, a single point. And here you kind of hone in on one area and you move more slowly over a particular area. You're just asking a lot about a little. So the first is asking a little about a lot. The other is asking a lot about a little. So you're like, let's focus in on this. Tell me more about that. And just question, because you want to know more. That seems to be what Jesus starts to do with the Samaritan woman in John 4, right? He kind of realizes what some of her issue is, and so he just starts asking her about her relationships and about her marriage. And, oh, tell me more. And it's just revealing, exposing her, and she's getting a little maybe evasive in that as well. But so this is intensive questioning. At this point, it's good to ask lots of follow-up questions. This often, 3 or 4 questions deep is where you really produce the most fruitful data. First question, maybe you kind of get in the door, on the front porch, and then you just kind of keep asking questions, and that's going to help them too to think more deeply about their situation. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 5 says this. Proverbs 20, verse 5. The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. So think, purpose, intentions, what's really going on. It's like a deep water. You look and you can't quite see the bottom. It's hard to tell. But a man of understanding who can ask good questions, who can draw them out, he's going to draw out the purposes of the heart. How's he going to draw out the purposes of the heart, which the person themselves may not know? Well, by asking good questions and following up and going extensive, intensive. And so those are big categories. So the rifle approach, asking a lot about a little, and then the rifle approach, kind of zooming in on an area and asking a lot about, what do we say? Yeah, a lot about a little. Yeah, that's right. I thought so. So that's the intensive, extensive. Any questions about that? All right. A few more points here related to how to gather data. And I got a number of R's here. So number one, ask reflective questions. Ask reflective questions. What do I mean? Ask open-ended questions, not closed questions. What do we mean by that? What is a closed-ended question? It's like a yes or no, yeah. It's a yes or no question. And you're not going to derive a lot from that. You'll learn some information, so don't rule those out, but it's not going to tell you much depth. It's just factual. It's just like, have you done this? Yes. Have you done that? No. What do you But an open-ended question is going to make them think more. It's not going to allow them to have a yes or no answer. This is especially great with teenagers who are learning to communicate, right? If you ask a lot of closed-ended questions, yes or no, it's going to be a difficult conversation. But if you focus on like more open-ended, they've got to think, they've got to put together a response. And so that's much more helpful. It promotes more reflection by the person. That's what I call a reflective question. Here's some examples. Wayne Matt gives a few of these. He says, here's a closed-ended question. Do you want to get married? Yes or no, right? Open-ended. What are your thoughts about marriage? Can you see how that's going to derive a lot more fruitful data for you about what they think about this? Closed-ended. Do you love your wife? Yes. What is he going to say in the meeting? No. Okay, great. 99% of the times they say yes. Okay, here's an open-ended question. In what ways do you demonstrate sacrificial love to your wife? Oh, okay. All right. I was listening to Stuart Scott on the one Care of Souls podcast, and he was talking to Adam Tyson about how when he wrote the book, The Exemplary Husband, which is phenomenal, he says in chapter 1, he kind of talks about his journey. He says there was this one moment he was serving, he was a pastor, and he's like, man, I thought I worked hard at church, and I love my wife, and I told her I loved her all the time, and yet, I was just very selfish with my time, when I get home and things like that, and not helping with my wife around the home. And he said, my wife asked me at one time, or she said, you're just acting very selfishly. And he's like, what? Are you kidding? I work so hard. I tell you I love you. And she said to him, this killed me. He said, she asked me, what ways do you love me sacrificially? Not when it's convenient for you, but going out of the way to sacrificially love me. And he was like, there's all kinds. And he's like, it was like a Google search where it's like searching, and then it goes, no results found. And he's like, and I had nothing. And he's like, and I went back and I spent some time with the Lord, and I'm like, surely, I'm just forgetting. And he's like, literally nothing. I did nothing here. No sacrifice, always convenient for me. And it was very convicting. And he just says, the Lord convicted me greatly. It was a big turning point for him in his life. And so can you see how he could have easily been asked by someone, or she could have said to him, do you love me? He was, yes, of course, I tell you every day. But then, how do you love me sacrificially, Scott, or Stuart Scott, and he's like, well, I'm sure I do. It's like, and so that's just so much more helpful. Okay, do you love her? Here's another one. Are you satisfied with your job? Or how about an open-ended version of that? What do you like or dislike about your job? Closed-ended. Do you get along with your parents? Open-ended. What kind of relationship do you have with your parents? So you can see, you could do this in a lot of ways. So generally, Wayne Mack says this, what questions produce much more information than why questions, which will often receive only the answer. So it's fine to ask why questions, but it's much better to ask what questions and keep it going. So ask reflective questions, number one. Ask repeated questions. Ask repeated questions. Follow up with another question to understand more fully. Don't just stop after one. Okay, that's interesting, but say, oh, okay, tell me more about that, or explain what do you mean by that. People use terms all the time, and you may think you know what their definition is, but say, well, when you say this, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And that's going to help you understand better what they're thinking. You don't want to be working from different dictionaries. So ask follow-up. Or you could also say this is what it sounds like is going on. Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that assessment? And maybe that gives them opportunity to say, yeah, that's really spot. Or they say, well, no, that's not what I meant. What I'm saying is this. And you're like, oh, okay. And then you kind of listen a little more, ask more questions. Then you might say, okay, so it sounds like you're saying this. This is the situation. Is that correct? And so you're just asking more questions, even to help them see that you're understanding what they're saying. So that's very helpful. Repeated questions. Ask relevant questions. Avoid general fuzzy questions, that aren't really related to the issue. How was your week? Is not very good. Stuart Scott says this: we sin in the specific and concrete. So ask questions in the specific and concrete. Trying to avoid fuzzy land. Make sure your questions go somewhere. They have a point, and try not to get sidetracked with rabbit trails. And don't ask questions just to satisfy your curiosity. If it's not relevant, you don't need to know it. Don't just gather what's relevant. Ask revealing questions. The heart is revealed by one's words, right? Jesus says in Matthew 12:34 and 36, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The mouth speaks. So when people say, I didn't mean to say that, what they really mean is, I didn't mean for you to hear that, right? Because if they said it, it's telling you something about their heart, right? It is the tattletale on the heart, your mouth is. So what we say, what we don't say, how we say it, it's just telling us what we value, what we're thinking about, what's on our minds. And so I gave you a whole bunch of heart questions, to get at the heart in a different session. So you have those. If you want me to dig those back up, I can give them to you. I just don't want to spend all our time going through those again. But we talked about probably 15 different heart-related questions to get out what's going on. So ask revealing questions about the heart. So these are some good ways to ask questions. All right, I've got one little section here. I got 4 minutes. Any questions on these or comments that you might have or follow-ups? She's getting to me too. All right, I'm assuming that me asking that question and receiving a no response or is indication that it's tracking. Here's just a few other things. What to listen for as you ask questions. What should you be listening for? Listen for repetition. Keep talking about the same thing or saying things in the same way. Listen for exaggeration of certain things or just kind of blowing things up out of proportion. Lying is a form of lying. Look for evasiveness. They're not giving clear answers. They kind of keep avoiding a certain topic. That's going to tell you something. We don't know what, but you just want to pay attention to that. Listen for hopelessness. Hopelessness. We talked about giving hope last time, but listen for that in the way they talk about it. And here's a key thing. When they describe their problem to you, do they mention God at all in the problem? If they can tell you about their whole situation, their problem, and not once reference God or their relationship to God or how the Lord is working or just anything related to that, that's a big tip off to you. And it may be helpful in the right tone to say, as I was hearing you describe your problem, I didn't hear you talk about God at all. Where is God in your situation? How are you thinking about that? And just to kind of give them another opportunity to think about that, and you're like, yeah, you're right. And then you might gently just point out, it's like, hey, maybe that's a good starting point for us here. If you're just kind of struggling and you're not really bringing God into the picture and how this relates, maybe there's some level of hopelessness there. But I want to reinfuse God into the situation and help you to see that. So does that sound like something reasonable? And they're like, yeah, of course, so we want to listen for that hopelessness. Listen for what is not said. Maybe you're like, something's missing here. Why? Listen for defensiveness. And why are they defensive? Listen for blame shifting. Think Genesis chapter 3 and the garden, and just, oh yeah, it's the wife you gave me. Oh, it's the serpent. Listen for that. Listen for victim mentality kind of language. Listen for calling sin sickness, if that's relevant. Rabbit trails they're going off on. Listen for things like, oh, I can't do that. It might mean that they mean, I don't want to do that, right? Now, if they are truly able to do what, you're saying God's word would say, then Maybe they're saying, I don't want to do this because it's hard. It's too hard. And so you want to help them and encourage them along in that way. Listen for judging motives. Judging motives. This is a huge thing where we just assume we know what's going on in someone else's heart, and we don't know. We're looking at behavior, but we don't know motives. Paul warns against judging motives in 1 Corinthians 4:5. How we ought not to do this. This is difficult not to, but he says, therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. And each one will receive his commendation from God. So, got to be careful there about judging motives. Listen for whether they're willing to accept responsibility for their part of it. You know, people come in, they're like, oh, it's all their issue. But someone said one time, God holds you 100% responsible for whatever percent of the problem is yours. So focus on that and not their part, right? So what part of this can I own and just lean 100% into instead of just putting it all on them? And then here's just some listening habits to avoid. Don't interrupt, right? Don't jump to conclusions. Remember, this is data gathering. You're trying to just listen and gather, and you're going to think about it more afterward. Don't let your mind wander. Don't do distracting things while they're talking. You know, we could list a lot of those. Don't allow the person to waste time. You know, if they're just kind of talking about whatever, like, hey, that, you know, if they do it once, you know, you're like, okay, you know, and you redirect it to the question. If they keep doing it, just like, hey, you know, we just really want to maximize our time here. You know, I'm happy to talk in another context, but we really want to focus on the problem here. And so, let's just try and keep focused here on this and different ways to redirect them. Don't hesitate to ask if you don't understand. You know, hey, let me stop you right there. What do you mean by that? You know, I'm having a hard time following you here. And then good to summarize what they're saying to avoid misunderstanding. So, wait to give too much feedback until you can think through the issues. Maybe in the first time especially that you meet with them, you say, you know, hey, I think we've done a lot of good here, just understanding the situation. Give me some time to process this and think about what would be relevant. And then you should just give them hope, right? And say, you know, let me kind of come up with a method here. I rarely want to just start to give a lot of stuff that's really pointed. Of course, there's always something that you can give as something that's hope-giving, but just say, hey, we want to really get this right. And I think people understand that. That's like, let's think about this, pray about this, and try and put together a plan that would be most helpful for you. And of course, you don't stop gathering after one time. You're constantly gathering data, so you're constantly listening. Even if you know other people who know them, maybe you learn stuff from them. You listen to how they pray. And you say, hey, why don't you pray? So you're learning, like, how do they think about prayer? How do they think about God? How do they, you know, how are they processing their problem in prayer? You know, observing them outside just a focused meeting time. And then maybe you give them some more homework that says, like, hey, I want you to do this, and it's going to help reveal some more questions about a particular area, and then you can talk over that. So those are some of the main things here. And next time we'll look at you've got all this mountain of data. Now what do you do with it? What do you do with it? How do you kind of put that into a helpful way for you and for them? So we've looked at why gather data, what data should be gathered, and then how data should be gathered. Okay, there we go. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Is that clear? Okay. Hopefully that's helpful. It's a lot, but like I said, if you want some of these notes, I'm happy to give them to you or point you to other resources. And of course, you don't have to remember all these things. I think it's just like a skill you grow at. And so just pick one of these, even if you just say, like, you know what, this month, just in my general relationships, I want to get better at open-ended questions. And so maybe you think, like, before I come to church, I want to talk to this person. And I've kind of got shut down, you know, so I'm just going to think of 3 open-ended questions that I can ask them beforehand. And then as I talk to them, I'm just going to, like, bring them out. Be like, hey, you know, and then let's let them talk, okay? And so maybe that's something you focus on, and we just grow in all these areas. So, all right, Lord, let me pray. Lord, thank you for even just the example of Christ and of you, Lord, even in the garden, drawing out Adam and Eve, asking them questions to reveal their hearts for themselves, and throughout Scripture doing that, and even Jesus modeling that for us, and Paul, and Lord, we want to be better in this so that we can give a better interpretation and real lasting help and change. So help us in this way to be patient listeners, to gather all the data, and both in formal context and in informal with our spouses, with our children, and just with coworkers, just to make sure we don't jump too quickly to conclusions that may not be accurate. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.